The mountain fog hangs low over 11 acres of hard Carolina ground, drifting past a barn that leans like it's tired of standing. Behind that barn, a mountain of ruined logs grows taller every week. The whole county calls it garbage. Then the camera moves closer past the sagging fence, past the peeling red paint, to a single door with light bleeding through the gap. Inside, a 15-year-old boy stands alone under one bare bulb, a chisel steady in his scarred hand, something enormous rising out of the wood in front of him. His eyes never lift. And 2 miles down the county road, a mud-brown truck turns onto the gravel, riding high in no hurry at all. Its headlights sweep the field. The man behind the wheel already knows what he wants. He's coming to take the ground beneath the boy's feet, and the boy doesn't hear the engine yet. Nobody in Blue Hollow could say for certain what the Whitfield boy was building behind that leaning shed, only that he vanished into it every afternoon the moment the school bus coughed him out at the end of the gravel lane. They knew the shape of his silence. They knew the sound of the flatbed truck that rolled in each Tuesday to drop another mountain of ruined timber behind his father's fence line. They knew he did not wave when they passed, did not come to the church suppers, did not run with the other boys down at the creek where the summers were spent. What they did not know, what none of them would know until the day a stranger pulled open those warped wooden doors and forgot how to speak, was that the wood everyone had written off as garbage had been quietly turned into something that did not seem possible. The Blue Ridge Mountains held their morning fog the way old men hold grudges, slow to let go, reluctant to admit the day had come. Below them, on the ragged outskirts of Asheville, a modest one-story farmhouse sat on 11 acres of thin mountain soil where the grass grew stubborn and the fences sagged. The scent of cut hardwood drifted across the property from a lumber operation 2 miles down the county road, mingling with wood smoke and wet leaves. The land had been in the family since before anyone living could remember, passed down through 3 generations of people who had worked it hard and been paid little, and it carried in every sagging post and rusted gate the history of a family that had never once had money, but had always until now had ground beneath its feet. It was the last week of September, the season when the maples along the ridgeline began to bleed color, and Caleb Whitfield was 15 years old, with hands that already looked older than the rest of him. He stood 5'7" and carried himself like someone trying not to be noticed, a lean frame built by labor rather than any sport. His dark hair fell messy beneath a faded cap gone gray with sawdust, and his hazel eyes had a peculiar way of moving through the world. They slid past people quickly, uncomfortably, as though eye contact cost him something he could not spare. But they could rest on a single length of timber for the better part of a quarter hour, without a blink reading it, the way a preacher reads scripture, patient, certain hunting, the meaning underneath the surface. His fingers were mapped with thin white scars, the leftover geography of years spent with carving knives that were never quite sharp enough or never quite dull enough. Around strangers, he said almost nothing. Inside himself, he said a great deal, kept a whole roaring country of thought behind a face that gave up nothing, and the gap between the two was the loneliest thing about him, though he would not have called it lonely because he had stopped having words for what he felt somewhere around the time the world took the one person who had ever understood him without needing them. 3 years earlier, the cancer had taken his mother in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and false cheer. The kind of room where the walls are painted a soft color meant to comfort people who are past comforting. She had been a small, bright woman named Ruth, quick to laugh, quick to see the good in a thing before she saw the trouble in it, and she had been the one who first put a whittling knife in the boy's hand and told him that everything in the world was already a shape that carving was just the business of taking away whatever was hiding it. The boy who walked out of that hospital was not the boy who had walked in. He had watched her grow smaller across a year of it, had watched hope get sold to his family in expensive installments, and never once delivered. And somewhere around the 3rd round of chemotherapy, he had understood a thing that no 15-year-old should have to understand, that words changed nothing, that a person could pray and weep and bargain, and it made no difference to the machine that was taking her. So he had stopped talking about how he felt. He had begun to make things instead, because a thing you made stayed made, held its shape, did not slip away from you in the night. Every failure, he came to believe, carried a lesson folded inside it, like a seed inside a husk. And that quiet conviction was the closest thing to faith he had left. The only altar he still knelt at the workbench under a single bulb. Marcus Whitfield was 46 and looked as though the mountains themselves had worked him over. Broad through the shoulders, weathered brown across the neck, his salt and pepper hair cropped close, and his beard grown thick enough to make him seem harder than he was. 20-odd years as a maintenance technician had knotted his lower back into permanent stiffness and left the backs of his hands cross-hatched with the small violences of the trade, the pale seams of old cuts, the thickened knuckles, a thumbnail gone black and grown out twice. He was not a man who found the shape of his love easily in his mouth. He had grown up under a father who measured a man by what he could fix and never by what he could say. And he had inherited that arithmetic whole, so that even now with everything narrowed down to just the two of them in that quiet house, he could not make the words for the things he felt toward his son come up past his teeth. Since his wife's passing, he smiled the way a drought lets rain rarely and never for long. But grief had not turned him mean, and that was a thing he had decided on purpose, standing over her grave with his son's cold hand inside his own, promising the freshly turned earth that whatever else he failed at, he would not fail the boy by going hard. What Marcus could not say he did. He sharpened Caleb's chisels in the evenings without being asked, holding each one to the oiled stone with the same care he'd once given the surgical patients of keeping old machines alive. He cooked eggs before dawn so the boy would not go to school hollow, and he learned to fry them the way Ruth had, with the edges crisped and the yolks soft, because the boy ate them without complaint that way and pushed them around the plate any other. Whenever he passed a thrift store in town, he came out with whatever dog-eared woodworking magazine he could find in the 50-cent bin, and he left them on the kitchen table without comment, the way another father might leave a note that said, "I am proud of you," if he had known how to write such a thing. He never once asked the boy to talk. He had learned that silence shared was its own kind of conversation, and that a man could love his son across a kitchen table without either of them saying a word all through supper. The barn behind the house leaned a few degrees off, true, its old red paint curling away in long strips after too many Appalachian winters. To every neighbor who drove the county road, it was an eyesore, a structure one hard storm from collapse, the sort of thing a tidy man would have pulled down years ago. To Caleb, it was the only room in the world where the rules made sense. He had claimed it the summer after the funeral, sweeping out decades of hay dust and mouse leavings, hauling out the rotted remains of stalls that had not held an animal since before he was born, running a single bulb from the house on a length of orange extension cord that snaked across the yard and glowed faintly warm against the cold. It had become the place where he went to be someone other than a boy his teachers described with the word withdrawn on every report card. Someone other than the kid whose mother had died. Someone whose hands knew exactly what they were for, even when the rest of him did not. Every Tuesday, not long after the fog lifted, the peace of the property broke under the diesel growl of a heavy flatbed climbing the grade. The truck belonged to Blue Ridge Timber, the lumber operation down the road, a business that milled flooring and construction stock, and had no patience for the pieces that would not cooperate. Twisted maple that warped the saw blades and threw the numbers off. Oversized walnut butts too heavy to bother squaring. Cracked oak spalted sections riddled with the black webbing of fungus hardwood that had grown around old fence wire a century back and gone strange and hard in the heart where the steel had healed over. All of it was money lost the moment it came off the truck at the Millwood that cost more to process than it could ever return, and rather than pay the county to haul it to the burn pile, the company had struck a quiet arrangement with Marcus a year back. They dropped the rejects on the unused eastern corner of his acreage, where they slid off the trailer and landed with thuds that a man could feel through the soles of his boots. And in exchange, Marcus asked for nothing because a man in his position had learned not to turn down anything free, even a thing that looked to the whole world like trash. The driver was Roy Tillman, past 60, a wide, slow man with silver hair pushed up under a cap that had once been blue and was now the color of dishwater. His face had settled into deep laugh lines, earned across a lifetime of finding the world more amusing than aggravating, and his accent came out of him like molasses off a spoon, unhurried and no rush to reach the end of any sentence. Roy had hauled timber up and down these grades for better than 30 years, had watched the mills change hands and the roads get paved and the young men come and go, and he had long ago stopped asking why the company did the things it did. To him, the great useless blocks tumbling off his trailer were nothing but the leavings of the trade, and it never once occurred to him in all those Tuesdays that a boy might be standing at the barn door watching them fall and seeing something else entirely. The neighbors saw the pile the way Roy did, only meaner. One farmer, a red-faced man named Purvis, who ran cattle on the next ridge, slowed his pickup by the fence one Tuesday and hollered through the window that the Whitfields were laying in firewood enough to outlast the next 100 years. Then drove off, pleased with himself before the boy could have answered even if he'd wanted to. An old woman who kept bees and opinions in equal measure, shook her head at the growing heap every time she passed and pronounced it scrap just scrap the way you'd pronounce a stray dog a lost cause. The men down at the feed store had a running joke that the boy was building an ark and had better hurry on account of how it kept raining. Caleb heard all of it one way or another, the way you always hear the things said about you in a small place. He never argued the point. Arguing meant caring what they thought, and he had trained himself out of that particular hunger. The way you train yourself out of favoring a broken bone by refusing to lean on it until one day you find you can walk without it at all. He waited instead. He waited until the truck had ground its way back down to the county road and the dust had settled over the gravel, and only then did he cross the field to the fresh pile alone, unwatched, free of every eye that would have made a performance of it. He laid his palm flat against the bark of a maple log nearly as tall as he stood, and his fingertips began their slow travel across every fissure and knot and curling grain hidden beneath the rough skin of it, reading the wood the way a blind man reads a face. Where the neighbors read defect, Caleb read intention. A crack was not a ruin to him, but a decision the tree had already made a place where the grain had been forced to go around something and had come out stronger for the going around. He had a way of leaning his head close to the wood as though it might tell him something. And once when his father caught him at it and asked what in the world he was waiting on out there in the cold, the boy answered without looking up, his voice low and certain in a way it never was inside the house. "It's not ready yet," he told him. "I'm waiting for it to tell me what it wants to be." Marcus had no idea whether the sentence made a lick of sense, but he had watched his son smile over a heap of garbage timber, an actual smile, small and private, the first he'd seen on that face since the funeral. And after the years they had come through together, that smile was enough to buy the boy any strange notion he pleased. The habit had started young long before the funeral, back when his grandfather was still alive, and had pressed into the boy's small hand a worn, bone-handled pocket knife that had already outlived two owners. The old man had shown him the first few cuts, how to work with the grain instead of against it, how to keep the blade moving away from the meat of your thumb, and then he had left the boy to teach himself the rest, which the boy did across whole summers of it. The birds came first, clumsy and thick-legged, and over the seasons the birds had grown into wolves, the wolves into dragons, the dragons into stranger and more ambitious creatures that lived only in his head until his hands dragged them out into the light. He had never sat in an art class. He had never held a tool that cost more than a tank of gas. Everything he knew he had scavenged the same way the wood was scavenged out of library books with cracked spines, out of grainy videos watched past midnight on a borrowed phone with the sound turned low so it wouldn't wake his father out of 10,000 hours of ruining things until slowly he ruined them a little less. His bedroom told the story better than he ever could. The shelves that had once held plastic action figures now held his own work. A carved eagle mid-scream with its wings thrown back beside a knight whose small hammered-looking armor caught the lamplight in 100 places. A wolf standing shoulder to shoulder with a dragon no bigger than a coffee mug. A small owl kept watch on his desk, every feather cut separately across one evening that had swallowed 8 hours whole and left his hands cramped into claws by the end of it. And still the boy dreamed past the walls of that little room, because whenever he watched some giant beast stalk across a movie screen or some cape figure haul a city up out of ruin, he did not see a character. He saw a shape waiting inside a log, a thing he might one day pull loose with his own two hands. Not a toy, but a sculpture that moved and menaced and grieved, that made a person stop in a doorway and feel something they could not name. He knew well enough that most people would laugh at a dream that size coming out of a kid in a leaning barn on the wrong side of Asheville. On his worst nights, the nights when the house felt too quiet and his mother's absence too loud, he laughed at it himself. Then Tuesday would come again, and the pile would grow, and the laughing would get harder to keep up. It was a walnut block that broke the dam a piece darker than wet coffee grounds, its grain running in long, twisting rivers that did not look like wood at all, but like muscle laid over bone, like something skinned. Caleb stood before it in the cold blue light of the barn one October night, with his homework finished and his father asleep in the house, and for the first time the shape came to him, whole and undeniable. Arriving all at once the way a name you've been chasing all day arrives the moment you stop chasing it. He had tried a dragon first weeks earlier, and the dragon had betrayed him 3 separate ways. One careless strike had parted its neck clean from its body, a single wrong angle undoing a week of evenings. A second attempt had lost an entire wing when a hidden tension deepened the maple, a memory the tree had kept of some old drought or lightning. Let go all at once with a crack like a rifle in the dark that made him drop the tool and stand there with his heart going. A third had leaned drunk on its base because he had ignored the grain direction, had tried to force the wood to hold a pose. It had no interest in holding, and it had punished him for the arrogance. He had set each ruined dragon on a shelf rather than in the burn barrel, lined them up where he would see them every day, because he wanted to remember exactly how each one had beaten him and exactly what it had cost. But the walnut did not want to be a dragon. The walnut wanted to be something monstrous and alive, all sinew and threat, a creature that looked as though it had been caught mid-lunge and frozen. And he spent the better part of 40 hours on the head alone, working tiny chisels between rows of teeth, so fine they seemed to want to snap under the least pressure. He worked past the point of exhaustion, past the point where his eyes blurred and his hand ached because there was a thing happening under his tools that he had never quite made happen before, a face rising up out of the dark grain that had a will in it, a hunger. When at last he stepped back to look, the tongue broke. It simply gave a sliver of it he had cut too thin, tumbling to the barn floor with a small sound that seemed far too quiet for what it meant. And he stood there in the dark with his chest gone tight and his eyes stinging in a way he refused to name, wondering whether every mouth on the county road had been right all along, whether these logs really were nothing but next winter's fire, and he was nothing but the fool who couldn't see it. He almost swept it into the trash. He had the broom in his hand, had already made the decision in the numb way you make decisions when you're too tired to argue with yourself. Then something made him look closer, made him crouch down and study the wreck of the mouth instead of turning away from it, and what he saw stopped him cold. The break had not ruined the mouth. The break had improved it. The jagged remainder of the tongue looked wilder, hungrier, more like a thing that had never been designed by anyone at all, but had simply crawled up out of the earth, already snarling. He set the broom aside. He picked the tool back up. He reshaped the whole snarling mouth around the accident, instead of against it, following where the break wanted to lead him. And when he finished near dawn with the birds starting up outside, the creature was fiercer and truer than anything he had planned. And something in the boy shifted on its foundation, a load-bearing thing moving into a better place. He stopped fighting the flaws in the wood. He started letting them lead. It became the quiet law he carved by from that night forward, the truest thing he knew and the thing he would spend the rest of his life proving out. The mistake was never the end of the work, only the place the work turned honest. After that, the shapes came faster and they came surer. A broad maple butt, squat and heavy, suggested clenched fists and mountainous shoulders, and gave him a green giant caught mid-roar, its whole body a knot of rage that the wild grain only made wilder. A slender ash log curved forward on its own, already leaning the way. A body leans when it's flung through open air, and became a figure caught mid-swing between two invisible towers, one arm reaching for a line that wasn't there. A clean, straight length of walnut with almost no grain at all. The plainest piece in the whole pile, polished up under his rag until it threw the bulbs light back like brushed steel. Though it was only wood, only a helmet, he had dreamed up out of an armored man on a screen. The eye slits dark and the surface so smooth it looked poured rather than carved. Each piece demanded some technique he did not yet have, so he invented it, or he failed and invented it on the second try. Knots became rivets and studs. Cracks became battle scars, the record of fights the character had survived. The natural darkening at a log's heart, the place where the tree had grown its densest wood, became the shadow beneath a heavy brow. His hands hardened past the point of blistering. His eyes sharpened until he could look at a rough log and see the finished thing standing inside it, ghostly waiting. His patience, which had already outlasted grief, learned to outlast failure too, which is a different and harder thing because grief only asks you to endure and failure asks you to begin again. By the middle of that autumn, the shelves that had once held whittled songbirds held legends. Instead, a whole silent company of them, standing shoulder to shoulder in the dust, and the wood shavings, each a hair better than the one before it, because every mistake from the last piece went on living quietly inside the next, correcting it, teaching it. The barn had become a hall of them. A boy could stand in the middle of that floor and turn slowly and see a year of his own becoming, looking back at him from every shelf. And Caleb did exactly that some evenings when the house was too empty to sit in. Which was the state of things on the evening a truck he did not recognize turned off the county road and rolled slow up the gravel, its headlights sweeping across the barn and pinning the boy for a moment in the doorway like something caught out of its burrow. It was not the Blue Ridge flatbed, not Roy's Easy Rumble. It was a jacked-up crew cab, mud-brown and loud. Riding high on tires meant more for show than for work, and the man who climbed down from it did not have Roy Tillman's slow, amiable way of moving. This one moved like the land already belonged to him, and he was only touring it. He was somewhere north of 50, thick through the middle, but hard with it, a barrel of a man who had done real labor in his life and never let a soul forget it. His name was Dale Crutcher, and his people had farmed and logged the next parcel over for 3 generations, which in his own private accounting gave him a standing claim on everything the ridge could see, every acre, every view, every neighbor's misfortune. He ran a small, rough sawmill on his side of the fence, cut fence rails and rough cedar and firewood by the cord. Honest, ordinary product. And he had watched the Whitfield place for years now, with the patient sideways appetite of a man who fully intends to own more than he does and is only waiting for the ground to soften. Marcus came out onto the porch wiping his hands on a rag, his shoulders already set, the way a man sets himself when he sees a certain truck in his yard. The two men had a history thin as ice on a spring pond and about as friendly. Dale had tried to buy a strip of the Whitfield bottomland years back low when Ruth was first sick, and the family was reeling, and Marcus had told him no in a tone that had ended the conversation and started a grudge. Dale did not bother with the courtesies now. He jerked his chin toward the eastern corner where the reject timber sat stacked in its ragged black mountain against the last of the light, and his voice carried across the yard flat and unbothered. "You know that pile of trash is costing you, don't you?" he said. "Costs me too. Man can't sell good bottomland with a garbage heap staring at it from the next lot over, brings the whole ridge down." Marcus said nothing, which was his way, and the silence stretched out between the two men until Dale filled it with the thing he had actually driven over to say the words easy and cruel and exactly how casual he kept them. "I'll take this whole hollow off your hands one of these days, Whitfield," he said, "and let it sit. Do us both a kindness. You know good and well you can't hold on to it much longer." The boy stood in the barn doorway with a chisel forgotten in his fist, and he understood 2 things at once, understood them in his gut before his mind had caught up. He understood that Dale Crutcher was not making idle conversation, that a man does not drive up a dark gravel lane in the cold to make idle conversation. And he understood from the way his father's jaw worked and refused to open from the particular stillness that came over Marcus, like a man absorbing a blow. He could not return that Dale had aimed his cruelty at something true, some soft, wounded place the boy had not known was there. Dale climbed back into his truck without waiting for an answer, which was its own kind of answer, and he backed down the gravel in a spray of stones and diesel, his taillights swinging across the yard and then shrinking and vanishing onto the county road. For a long moment, neither Whitfield moved, father on the porch and son in the barn door, the cold settling down over both of them. Then Marcus went inside without a word, and Caleb, through the yellow-lit kitchen window, watched his father reach up and take an envelope down off the top of the refrigerator. The good hiding place. The place things went in that house when they were meant to be kept from a boy's eyes and stand there holding it under the light, with his back bent like a man carrying something a great deal heavier than his own frame. Caleb did not sleep much that night. He lay in the dark, listening to the house tick and settle around him, listening for his father's breathing to go slow and even down the hall. And in the morning, while Marcus was showering for work, with the pipes knocking in the walls, he did a thing he was ashamed of, even as his hand reached for it. He took the envelope down himself. The letter had belonged to the bank in town, the one with the flag out front and the drive-through window where his mother had once let him lick the deposit envelopes. The words on the page were the careful, bloodless words that institutions use to describe the end of a family, words chosen precisely so that no single one of them could be held against anybody, and the boy read them twice before the meaning fully arrived and settled into him like cold water finding the bottom of a well. Notice of default. Amounts past due. A date 90 days out printed in a bland column as though it were any other number a Tuesday like all his other Tuesdays, except that on the far side of it, his family would no longer own the ground they stood on. And beneath the mortgage figure, itemized as though it were a separate and additional cruelty, a second and much larger set of numbers he recognized without needing to be told what they were. Because he had watched them accumulate one hospital bill at a time, 3 years before had seen the same envelopes come and come and come, while his mother grew smaller in the next room. The cancer had not only taken her, it had gone on taking quietly, month after month, after she was in the ground out of a checking account that had never been deep to begin with, the interest compounding in the dark until the debt had grown large enough to swallow the house and the 11 acres and the leaning barn where the boy's whole remaining life now lived. He put the envelope back exactly as he'd found it, squared to the edge of the refrigerator top, the way his father kept it. He set his father's coffee cup where it always went. The handle turned out, and he stood a moment in the quiet kitchen, understanding at last what the reject timber truly was. It was not garbage. It had never been garbage. It was one of the last threads holding the whole thing together, the free wood the company gave them, being one less expense in a life that had been stripped down to nothing but expenses. And Dale Crutcher's loud contempt for that pile was not contempt at all. It was strategy dressed up as insult. The man wanted the Whitfields gone, had wanted it for years, and he had driven over in the dark to remind them in a voice pitched to sound like neighborly candor that gone was only a matter of time and paperwork. The boy did not tell his father what he had read. He carried it alone the way he carried everything, folded up small and pressed down deep where it would not show on his face across the breakfast table. He went to school. He came home. He walked out to the barn as he always did, but the light inside it looked different to him now. Thinner somehow, provisional, a room borrowed against a debt that was already coming due. He stood before the walnut monster in the swinging ash figure and the steel-bright helmet, the whole silent company of them. And for the first time, the work felt less like a refuge and more like something he was standing in the doorway of, about to lose the way you look at a house you're moving out of and see it suddenly as just walls. He did not stop, though. That was the thing about Caleb Whitfield, that even his father did not fully grasp the iron in the boy that grief had forged rather than broken. The boy did not stop. He picked up his sketchbook, the cheap spiral one with the cover worn soft, and he began to plan the largest thing he had ever attempted. Because if he was going to lose the barn, then he was going to leave something standing in it first, that could not be argued with, could not be laughed off, could not be called firewood by any man with eyes in his head. He had been circling a particular log for weeks, walking past it, laying his hand on it, walking away a maple butt shot through with a rippling flame figure, so wild and so alive that the grains seemed to move when you turned your head to flow like fire caught in the wood. He knew at last what wanted out of it. Not a hero this time, a giant, a great-scaled creature dragged up whole out of legend, every plate of its hide catching the light like moving water, a thing that would stand taller than the boy who carved it and would make even a man like Dale Crutcher stop in the doorway and go quiet. He gave it every free hour of the weeks that followed. The scales alone ran into the thousands, each one cut by hand, each one raising the odds that a single slip of a tired blade would ruin the whole piece and waste a month of evenings. He carved past dark most nights. He carved on Saturdays until his back cramped, and his fingers would not fully straighten until his father came out to the barn with 2 cups of hot chocolate, going cold in the air, and stood watching him work in silence, which was the way Marcus had learned to say the things he could not say. One such evening, his father set the cups down on the bench and asked quiet why the boy was pushing so hard on a thing nobody had ordered and nobody was paying for. And Caleb answered without stopping his hands, without lifting his eyes from the scale he was cutting. Because it's mine while I'm making it, he said. Nobody can take the part that's still in my hands. Marcus looked at his son for a long moment across the cold barn air, and something moved behind his weathered face that he did not let reach his mouth. Then he picked up his own cocoa and drank it, standing there, and neither of them said a single word about the envelope on top of the refrigerator, though it sat between them the whole time as real and as heavy as the log on the bench. The great creature took its shape slowly, the way trust takes shape, the way a thing worth having always takes shape, and by the 3rd week of it, The thing had begun to breathe. It was not finished, would not be finished for a long while yet. Whole ranks of scales along the spine and down the long sweep of the tail were still only pencil lines waiting to be cut, a map of work not yet done. But the head was done, and the vast chest was done, and the muscles of it moved beneath the flame grain, as though something enormous had paused mid-stride inside the barn, and might at any moment finish the step and bring the whole roof down. Caleb had stopped seeing it as a sculpture somewhere along the way. He had started seeing it as a witness, as the thing that would stand in that barn when he could no longer stand there himself, and testify that a boy had once been here and had seen what nobody else could see. It was on an ordinary gray afternoon with the light going flat and the first real cold of the year working its way under the barn door that a second unfamiliar vehicle came up the gravel lane. This one was a plain older pickup moving careful on the ruts, and the man who got out of it moved slow and deliberate, a man in no particular hurry to be anywhere. He was tall past 50, broad across the shoulders, in a way that had gone a little soft with the years, with neatly kept gray hair and a short salt and pepper beard framing a square jaw. His eyes were a pale, patient blue that seemed to weigh a thing carefully before deciding what to think of it, and to think well of very little. His name was Walter Boone, and he had spent his whole life restoring old houses across the western part of the state, which is a trade that teaches a man to see exactly how things were made to read. The hand of a dead carpenter in a joint cut 200 years ago, and to grieve quietly and constantly when things are made carelessly by people who do not love them. Walter had not come for the boy. He had never heard of the boy, would not have believed you if you told him what he was about to find. He bought reclaimed lumber from Blue Ridge Timber now and again for his restoration work, salvaging the good straight grain out of the pieces the mill could not use, matching old growth to old growth so a repair would disappear into a wall that predated the Civil War. Someone at the mill office had mentioned in passing that a stack of unusually figured rejects sat on the Whitfield corner, out past the county road that the old man let them pile up out there, and might be talked into parting with a few for cheap. So Walter had driven out to inspect a garbage heap. That was the whole of his errand. He walked the eastern corner with his hands buried in his coat pockets against the cold, turning over a spalted oak butt. Here with the toe of his boot running a thumb along a curl of figured maple there, murmuring to himself the way craftsmen do when they think they're alone, taking his time in the failing gray light. He was nearly finished, nearly ready to leave a note under a rock on the porch about a couple of pieces he might come back for, when he noticed that the barn door stood open, a hand's width in a single bulb burned inside, against the gathering dark, warm and small. He was not a man who pried into other people's business. But the light drew his eye the way a lit window will always draw the eye of a person walking through the cold and through the gap. He caught the edge of a shape that had no business being in a barn, a long curve of carved scale catching the bulb and throwing it back, and something in a lifetime of loving handmade things pulled him across that yard against every rule of manners he'd been raised on. He put his fingers to the rough, weathered door and pushed it wide. And Walter Boone, who had walked through grand old houses that took the breath clean out of him, who had knelt to handle 200-year-old joinery cut by masters long dead, who was not by any measure a man given to standing slack-jawed at anything this world had left to show him, stood slack-jawed in that barn doorway with the cold pouring in past him. He forgot the reclaimed lumber. He forgot the note he'd meant to leave. His eyes traveled the crowded shelves, the whole silent company of legends risen up out of ruined wood, the fierce walnut mouth, and the swinging figure straining toward its missing line, and the helmet that threw back light like poured steel. And then his eyes climbed slowly, the great unfinished creature rising up out of the center of the barn floor, its thousands of scales half cut, its flame grain rippling and flowing in the bulb light, so that the thing seemed to breathe. Its half-made face turned toward the door, as though it had been waiting there in the dark all along for someone to come and finally understand it. The barn was silent, but for the tick of the cooling wood stove in the corner, and the boy's own slow breathing, and the man in the doorway did not speak. Could not speak because there are things a person stumbles onto in this life that cost them all their words at once and leave them standing there empty and full at the same time. Caleb stood beside his workbench with a chisel in his scarred hand, and his whole secret life laid out on the shelves around him for a stranger to see, and he watched the man discover it, and he did not know whether to feel proud or afraid. because the last time a man he did not know had come up that gravel lane, the man had come to pull the ground out from under his family's feet. When Walter finally found his voice, it came out low and roughened, more question than statement, the words of a man asking to be told a thing he already knew and could not quite believe. "Son," he said, "did you make all of these?" Caleb nodded once, a small motion. Walter's eyes went back to the great flame-scale creature and stayed there a long moment, tracing the endless ranks of hand-cut scales without ever quite touching his hand, hovering an inch above the wood, the way you hold your hand near a fire. And when he spoke again, he said the truest thing anyone had said to the boy in 3 years. And he said it quiet, almost to himself, almost like a prayer. "You've barely scratched the surface of what's in you," he said. And for the first time since that hospital room, since the day the world had taught the boy that hope was a currency, it would not honor someone from outside the walls of that leaning barn, had looked at what Caleb Whitfield made with his hands, and had seen exactly and entirely the thing the boy himself saw standing there in the doorway, with the cold coming in behind him, and 90 days ticking quietly down on top of a refrigerator 200 feet away, neither of them yet knowing what that pile of garbage timber was about to become, or what it would cost to get there. Walter Boone came back on a Thursday, which surprised no one in this world more than it surprised Walter Boone. He had spent the days between telling himself he was too old and too settled to go chasing after some half-formed notion in a stranger's barn that a man who had built a whole careful life on the principle of knowing better ought at his age to know better than this, and he had lost that argument with himself every single time he'd had it lying awake, turning it over. So he arrived that second afternoon towing a small enclosed trailer behind the old pickup, though he could not have told you what he meant to haul in it, only that a man ought to be ready when he did not yet understand what he was going to be ready for. He spent close to an hour that day moving through the barn without once reaching for his wallet, which was not how Walter Boone had inspected anything in the whole of his long working life. He circled the swinging ash figure, crouching, to see how the boy had made dead wood lean into a motion it had no right to hold. He got down on one knee to study the underside of the walnut monster, where the grain ran off into a chaos of knots, and he saw how the boy had let the chaos become the thing instead of fighting it. He asked the boy why the maple of the great creature had been left rough and tooled along one flank when it had been sanded down to glass along the other, expecting some fumbled answer, and Caleb told him plainly that the rough side caught the shadow and held it, that a thing carved too clean and too even, all over stopped looking alive, went dead and smooth like a factory thing. And Walter straightened up slowly with the particular expression of a man who has just been handed a truth he had spent 40 years half knowing by someone 4 decades his junior. He did not hand out compliments, Walter Boone. Compliments were cheap, and he did not deal in cheap things. He handed out questions instead, harder ones each time, the way a whetstone hands a blade its edge by wearing against it, until the boy found himself defending choices he had made purely by instinct, and discovered as he heard his own answers come out of his mouth that the instinct had good reasons living underneath it that he had never once bothered to dig up and name. When at last the questions ran dry, Walter folded his arms across his chest and looked one more long time at the great half-finished creature rising out of the floor. Then he delivered the sentence he had driven 40 minutes of mountain road to deliver, though he had not known it was the sentence until it was out. "These can't stay in a barn where nobody sees them, son," he said. "Locking work like this away from the world isn't humility. Whatever you tell yourself, it's a kind of theft." Caleb turned that over, unsure whether he'd been paid a compliment or handed an accusation. "They're not ready," he said. "Half of them still need work. A man shouldn't go showing the world a thing he hasn't finished proving out to himself first." Walter almost smiled at that, the corner of his mouth going. "They'll never be finished if you wait to be sure," he said. "Sure is a country nobody's ever actually set foot in. You just plant your flag a little short of it and call the ground you're standing on close enough, and you get on with the work." It took the better part of 2 weeks for that idea to grow legs under it, and it took Walter Boone driving out a third time to make the case standing on the porch in front of Marcus, because the old craftsman understood that the boy's yes meant exactly nothing without the father's yes behind it. The Mountain Heritage Craft Fair came every autumn to the fairgrounds on the north edge of Asheville. 3 days of woodworkers and blacksmiths and quilters and potters and furniture builders, drawn down out of the hollows from across the western counties. The sort of gathering where a careful man might sell a whole season's work in one good weekend, or might sell nothing at all and drive home poorer by the price of the booth. Marcus stood on his porch with his arms crossed, listening to Walter lay it all out, his face giving up nothing, a thick vein of suspicion running through everything he heard, because he could not for the life of him see how any of it was worth the gas money and the exposure. He had learned the hard way, 3 long years of hard way, that hope had a habit of billing you after it had already left the room. What finally moved Marcus was not a single word of Walter's careful argument. It was his son's face. Marcus had spent 3 years watching that face stay carefully closed, a door pulled to and latched against the weather, and standing there in the cold on his own porch, he watched it open, just a crack, just a hair at the mere mention of people, actual living people walking past a table and stopping to see the thing the boy had made. It frightened him, that small opening, more than the suspicion did, because a thing that can open is a thing that can be slammed, and he did not know if the boy could survive another slamming. But he had made a promise over his wife's grave with the raw dirt still mounded, and the boy's cold hand in his, that whatever else he got wrong in the years to come, he would not be the one who taught his son to stop trying. So he uncrossed his arms slowly, and he said the only thing a man in his position could say. "One booth," he said. "We'll see." It was not enthusiasm, would never have passed for it. It was permission, which from Marcus Whitfield was very nearly the same thing, and the boy heard the difference between the two clear as a struck bell. The days before the fair emptied Caleb out and filled him back up at the same time. He did not sleep so much as pace the shallow hours between sleeping, choosing pieces and unchoosing them, wrapping them careful in the old moving blankets Walter had brought over, deciding a dozen times which of his legends were fit to be seen, and then undeciding it all again in the dark. He would not bring the great flame-scaled creature. It was too large to move safely, too unfinished to be understood by strangers, and too much if he was honest with himself, like carrying his own beating heart out into a field full of people who might step on it. He chose the walnut monster instead, and the swinging figure, and the steel-bright helmet, and the green giant caught mid-roar, and a careful handful of the smaller pieces that had first taught him the difference between a knot and a ruin. He built a simple pine display stand himself across one long evening, sanded it smooth, rubbed oil into it until the grain came up warm, because he would not set his legends down on a bare folding card table like so much garage sale junk to be pawed over and priced to move. The morning of the fair came in cold and hard and bright, a killing frost silvering the windshield of the truck so that Marcus had to run it a while to see. They loaded the pieces with a care that came very near to prayer. Marcus lifting the heavy walnut with his ruined back, and the boy steadying it, neither of them speaking the way they did most things that mattered between them. The fairgrounds, when they finally reached them and got the truck back to their assigned spot, undid something in Caleb before he had even unloaded a single piece. The other booths overflowed on every side, with a competence so easy and so total that his stomach dropped through the floor of him. Rocking chairs steam bent and pegged together without a single nail. Cabinets of tiger maple that glowed like they were lit from somewhere inside the wood. Cutting boards laid up end grain in patterns so precise they looked cut by a machine. Priced high and moving fast into the canvas tote bags of people who had come up the mountain that morning knowing exactly what they wanted and exactly what it was worth. His own small table sat wedged between a leather-faced man who had been building Windsor chairs for 30 years and a woman selling live-edge slab tables that each cost more than the Whitfield's whole truck, and the boy set his monsters down among all that polished, settled tradition, feeling like a crow that had blundered in through an open window into a room full of swans. The morning went the way he had feared it would, only slower, which was its own particular torture. People came. That was the cruelty of the thing. They came in their thousands up and down the crowded aisles with their paper coffee cups and their strollers and their good-natured mountain patience, and they slowed at his table and they looked and they moved on. A woman studied the walnut monster a long moment, with her head tilted, something working behind her eyes, then pulled her husband along by the sleeve before he could set down his coffee. A whole cluster of children discovered the green giant and stood pointing at it, delighted, tugging at their parents' coats until the parents steered them firmly off toward the kettle corn and the quilts with the practiced efficiency of people who had not driven up a mountain to buy a carved horror for a boy who would only lose interest in it by Christmas. A man in a good wool coat picked up one of the smaller pieces, turned it over in his hands, checked the underside for a maker's mark or the tell of a machine, set it down again without a word, and drifted away. Every polite half-smile landed on Caleb, like a small door closing softly somewhere in a long hallway. Nobody was cruel to him. That was almost the worst of it. Cruelty would at least have meant he'd provoked a reaction made an impression mattered enough to be struck at. What he got instead was the gentle, distracted indifference of people who had already spent their money on things that made plain sense to them. By noon, he had sold nothing. By 2, he had still sold nothing, and he had begun without quite deciding to do it to wrap the smaller pieces back into their blankets one by one, telling himself he was only tidying the display, knowing perfectly well he was not. Marcus watched him do it from the folding chair beside the table, said nothing for a good while, then reached over and laid one scarred hand on his son's shoulder, the weight of the hand carrying more than any words could have. One slow day never decided a man's whole life, he said. It only feels like it does while you're standing in it. The boy nodded because a nod was the whole of what he could manage right then. He wanted to believe his father. He had wanted to believe a great many things across 3 hard years, and he had learned down in his bones exactly how far wanting a thing got you when the world had other plans. That was the exact moment Dale Crutcher found him. The man came down the aisle the way Dale Crutcher came everywhere, like the crowd was clearing out of his path as a professional courtesy, a paper boat of fried dough dripping honey in one fist, his small eyes already fixed on the Whitfield table with an ugly light of recognition kindling in them. He had a booth of his own, 3 rows over rough-cut cedar planters and split firewood. By the truckload, the honest, ordinary product of a man who milled what the mountain gave him, and never once in his life wondered whether it might have wanted to be anything more. He stopped square in front of Caleb's display. He looked a long moment at the walnut monster. He looked at the boy. Then he raised his voice, and he did not raise it to Caleb, never once to Caleb, but out to the aisle, out to the drifting, indifferent crowd, pitching it high and carrying the way an auctioneer pitches a bid over a noisy barn. "Well, look here," he said. "Folks, come and see. This here is the garbage pile boy." He let it hang in the air, grinning, licking honey off his thumb. "You know his daddy's got a whole heap of ruined timber rotting away behind their place out on the county road, and this right here is what the kid does with the trash. The mill won't even trouble itself to burn. Charges money for it, too." Now that he said and looked around to gather his crowd. That is a hustle. The words did precisely what words are built to do when a man aims them right and has practice at the aiming. Heads turned all down the aisle. A few people slowed, uncertain, sensing a scene brewing the way a herd of cattle senses weather, coming wanting to watch and not wanting to be caught watching. Caleb felt his face go hot and then go cold, felt his hand stop dead on the blanket he'd been folding, felt every eye in that whole stretch of the fairland on him at once, which was the one single thing in all the wide world he had spent 3 careful years arranging his entire life to avoid. Dale kept right on going, warming to it now, feeding on the small crowd he'd gathered around himself like a fire-fed dry pine. "I don't know how they see fit to let scavenger work in here, alongside real craftsmen," he said, loud, jovial, cruel. "A man builds a chair now. That's a trade that's 40 years of learning. A kid glues monsters together out of firewood. That's a yard sale. Somebody ought to go have a quiet word with the fair board about who exactly they're renting tables to these days." He never once shouted. He never had to shout. He knew the way a certain low kind of man always knows in his bones that a thing said pleasantly and smiling in front of 100 strangers cuts a boy twice as deep as the same thing screamed at him in private. Marcus came up out of the folding chair, and for one terrible suspended second, the whole afternoon balanced on a knife's edge over something that would have ended with sheriff's deputies and a foreclosure that came a great deal faster than 90 days. His big scarred fists were closed white. His jaw had gone to stone. Dale saw it, and Dale welcomed it, tilting his chin up in open invitation, because a man losing his land and then losing his temper in front of 100 witnesses was exactly the kind of story Dale Crutcher would have loved to be able to tell for years afterward down at the feed store. It was the boy who stopped it. Caleb put a hand flat against his father's chest. Not hard, not pushing, just there, just present. And something in that small, quiet contact reached Marcus in a place that words could not have reached, reminded him in one breath of everything he still had to lose, and how terribly little it would take to lose it. The father stood down, the white fists open. He lowered himself back into the chair slowly, his eyes never once leaving Crutcher's face, breathing like a man holding an enormous stone off his own chest by main strength. Dale grinned wider, having gotten most of what he'd come 3 rows over to get. Then he leaned down close enough that only the two Whitfields could hear the last of it, and he dropped the performance entirely. Let the real things show through underneath the jolly like the rot under fresh paint. "Sell up, boy," he said low and flat. "Save your daddy the shame of the bank doing it for him in front of the whole county. That pile behind your place isn't art. It's just the reason you're going to be gone by spring." Then he straightened back up to his full height, saluted the whole aisle cheerfully with his dripping paper boat of dough, wished everyone a fine afternoon in a voice bright as a Sunday church bell, and walked off, whistling some old tune, leaving the boy standing there alone among his monsters, with the little crowd dispersing around him in that particular embarrassed hurry of people who have just watched something ugly happen and would very much rather they hadn't. For a long while after Caleb did not move at all, something in him had gone very quiet, quieter even than grief. The particular stillness of a thing deciding whether or not to break clean through. He looked at the walnut monster he had carved through 40 hours of failure and near failure, looked at the swinging figure that had first taught him that dead wood could hold living motion, and for the first time since the night the tongue had broken and taught him better, he wondered whether the whole county had been right about him all along, whether a boy who filled a leaning barn with scavenged nightmares was exactly the sad little fool that Dale Crutcher had just stood up and announced him to be in front of everyone. He reached again for the blankets. This time he meant it all the way down. He was going to pack the pieces up. He was going to load the truck. He was going to drive home in the dark to a barn he could not keep, past a pile of wood that was slowly and surely costing him everything. And he was going to accept at long last the lesson the world had been trying so patiently for 3 years to teach him that hope billed you after it left, and the bill always came due. He had one piece half wrapped in his lap when a shadow fell across the table, and a voice he did not know spoke to him over the noise of the fair, low and unhurried, more plainly curious than kind. "Don't put that one away just yet," the voice said. "I've been standing back there a good 10 minutes, trying to work out how in the world you got a piece of walnut to snarl like that." The woman was tall and built like someone who spent her days on her feet in strange places, 28 or so, with shoulder-length auburn hair pushed back off a lightly freckled face and quick green eyes that moved across the crowded table, the way the boy's own eyes moved across a raw log, hunting the shape hiding underneath the surface. She carried a small camera bag slung across her body, the easy way another person might carry a wallet, as though it were simply one of the parts she'd been assembled from. Her name was Hannah Reeves, and she had come up from Nashville chasing a story about the fair for a modest audience she had built over 3 patient years online, a following that had grown out of the morning she'd walked away from a good salary. Writing advertising copy the day she finally understood that she had spent a whole decade of her one life making people want things instead of showing them things worth wanting. She did not sell anything to anyone. She did not buy anything. What she did, the only thing she had ever been any good at, was find the people the world had hurried past without seeing and then make the world stop and look. She did not ask the boy the price of the monster. Everyone else who'd stopped had eventually asked the price if they asked anything at all. She asked him instead how he had done it, and then before he could stammer through an answer, she asked what he was working on now, which was not a question one single soul at that whole fair had thought to put to him, because everyone else had come to buy the finished thing, and she alone had come to find the unfinished one. Caleb hesitated a long moment, still half standing in the cold country Dale had marched him out into. Then he answered before he could talk himself back out of it, because there was something in the patient way she waited on him that did not feel like the front end of a trap. He told her haltingly about the great flame-scaled creature back home in the barn, the one too large and too raw to have brought the one whose thousands of scales were still only pencil lines waiting down the long sweep of its tail. Hannah's whole face changed as he spoke. The polite professional interest slid clean off it and was replaced by the wide, still open look of a person who has just realized the real story is a great deal bigger than the small errand that brought them out. "You've got something like that at home," she said slowly, "and you brought these instead." She shook her head, half a laugh caught somewhere in it. Kid, would you let me come see it? Not to buy. I told you I don't want to buy anything off you. I just think somebody ought to be there in the room when you finish a thing like that. He looked to his father, Marcus, who had spent the whole grinding afternoon absorbing a public humiliation for his son's sake and swallowing it whole, who trusted strangers about as far as he could throw. The loaded truck studied Hannah Reeves for a long, careful moment with his suspicious mountain eyes, reading her the way he read a used part somebody was trying to sell him. Then he gave a single short nod because he had also spent 3 hard years learning to tell the difference between people who wanted something from his son and the far rarer people who wanted something for him. And this one, he judged standing there with her honest camera and her quiet question was the rarer kind. She followed them home in a dusty little compact car that had plainly seen the wrong side of 100 gravel lanes, arriving just as the light went long and gold across the ridgeline and the shadows of the fence posts stretched out across the yard. She did not gasp when she stepped into the barn, which Caleb noted and quietly respected her for. She went still instead, the way Walter had gone, still moving slow among the crowded shelves in the failing light, letting the pieces simply be what they were without narrating over the top of them or reaching for her camera too soon. Then she set a small camera up on a tripod in the corner, checked something on its little glowing screen, looked over at the boy, and gave him the only instruction she would offer him all evening long. Don't perform for me, she said. Don't explain anything. Don't do a single thing on my account. Just work exactly like I'm not here, and I'll take care of the rest. Then she stepped back into the shadows behind the tripod, and she disappeared as thoroughly as a living person can disappear while still standing in a small room, went so quiet and so still that within 10 minutes the boy had nearly forgotten she was breathing there at all. What she filmed over the next 3 hours was not a demonstration of anything. It was a boy at his work. Caleb chose the flame-scaled creature because it was the thing he had told her about, and because some part of him, the exact part that Dale had tried so hard to kill in that aisle a few hours before, needed badly to prove to itself that it was still alive and beating. He sharpened his chisels on the oiled stone his father had prepared for him, without being asked the small ritual sound of it filling the barn. He stood a long time in front of the great, half-finished beast without touching it at all, reading the ranks of uncut scales, and Hannah's camera drank in the reading. The stillness, the way the boy's hazel eyes went far away and dead certain at the very same time. Then he began to cut one scale, and then the next one, and then the one after that, hundreds of them marching in their careful rows down the long sweep of the tail. Each single cut a small decision made and committed to each one a place where one slip of a tired blade would ruin a month of a boy's life. Curls of pale maple fell soft and steady to the barn floor and gathered around his boots. The single bare bulb threw his moving shadow up huge and trembling against the far wall, so that it looked at times as though the boy and the dragon were the same creature. Neither of them said one word for a very long time, because there was nothing either of them could have said that would have improved on the thing the quiet camera was already keeping safe. Near the very end, without lowering his tool, without so much as turning his head toward her, the boy said the one thing he offered up out loud that whole long evening, and he said it half to Hannah and half to the wood and half to himself, which is more than a whole, but grief does not divide itself cleanly. People think I'm making these out of nothing, he said. I'm not. Everybody threw this wood away because all they could ever see was what was wrong with it. I just never learned how to do that. Look at a thing and see only what's wrong with it. The camera held steady on his moving, scarred hands. Hannah did not answer him. She had learned a long time ago out in the field that the very worst thing a person could do to a true sentence was to answer it. When she finally packed up her small camera to leave, full dark had come down over the hollow, the cold gone hard and clean, the stars thick and close overhead, the way they only ever get that far from the lights of any town. She thanked the boy for letting her in, which was a thing very few grown people in his life had ever once thought to say to him. And then she stood by the door of her dusty car with her hand resting on the cold metal, honest all the way to the end of it. I've got no idea how many folks are going to watch this, she said. Could be a couple hundred, could be nobody at all. But I know down in my gut that I filmed something real tonight, something people ought to see, and I have been doing this long enough now to know exactly how rare it is to feel that sure. She got in and she backed carefully down the dark gravel, and her tail lights swam away into the trees and were gone, leaving father and son standing together in a cold yard beside a barn they could not keep. Neither of them daring to let themselves hope the strange evening had changed one single solitary thing. Because hope they had both learned the same hard way billed you after it left. 3 days later, Hannah posted it. She had cut the 3 long hours down to 11 quiet minutes, and she had laid the boy's own few words over the top of his moving hands, and she had called it simply the story of a 15-year-old turning scrap wood into legends. Then she sent it out into the wide, indifferent world with the same modest expectation she had spoken aloud by her car that maybe a few hundred people might watch it, that maybe it might do a small, quiet bit of good somewhere. Caleb barely thought about it at all. He went to school. He came home. He finished his homework at the kitchen table and he walked out to the barn in the cold, and he kept cutting scales because the great creature did not care in the least whether the world was watching, only whether the boy was. Then Marcus's phone began to ring, and it did not stop. It started as a trickle a man could ignore a text from Walter, a message from someone Marcus half knew at the mill office. By the second day, it had become a thing that woke the whole house buzzing and buzzing on the kitchen counter. At hours, no decent person telephoned a number Marcus did not recognize, followed hard by another he did not recognize, followed by 50 more behind that. Hannah's 11 quiet minutes had slipped some invisible latch somewhere out in the world. People were not simply watching the thing. They were sharing it 1 to 10 to 10,000 to more than anyone could count, because they had not stumbled onto a video about woodworking at all. They had stumbled onto something they had not known. They were starving for a boy, taking the exact thing the whole world had thrown away and refusing gently and stubbornly and without any fuss at all to agree that it was garbage. The comments ran up into the thousands and then past all counting. A man in Ohio wanted a walnut monster of his very own. A woman in Arizona wrote that she had lost her only son the year before and that she wanted the swinging figure because to her it looked exactly like a person flying free of everything that had ever held them down. Collectors wrote asking after the steel bright helmet. Strangers from every far corner of the country wrote not to order a single thing, but only to tell the boy that they had never in their lives seen wood carry that much life in it, that they had sat at their own kitchen tables and watched his scarred hands move and had wept over a thing they could not have named if you'd asked them. Caleb stood alone in the barn one evening, reading them off his father's phone, scrolling down and down through them with a slow disbelief, and something in his chest that had been clenched shut for 3 solid years loosened just one single notch. For the first time since the hospital room, the whole world outside the walls of that leaning barn had looked hard at the thing he made with his hands and had seen precisely what he himself saw in it. He set the phone down on the bench. He did not yet know how to feel a thing that large did not have the room in him for it. So he did the only thing he had ever known to do with a feeling too big to be held. He picked up his chisel and he turned back to the great flame-scaled creature and he cut the next scale and then the one after it. It should have been the turning of the tide, in a fairer story than the one the boy was living it would have been. But the very same wind that carried Hannah's 11 minutes clear across the country carried it just as surely and just as fast 3 rows over at the fairgrounds and then 2 miles down the county road to a small rough sawmill on the parcel that shared a fence line with the Whitfields, where Dale Crutcher sat in his office and watched a boy he had publicly branded a scavenger become in the space of a single week the most talked about thing to come up out of Blue Hollow in a generation. Dale did not congratulate a living soul. Dale sat there and did the arithmetic, the cold private arithmetic he was always doing behind his small eyes. A boy with a name and an audience was a boy who might just find a way to keep the land. After all, might somehow turn that garbage pile into the very thing that saved the ground Dale had been waiting years and years to get his hands on. And Dale Crutcher was not now and had never been a man who let a thing he wanted slip loose from his grip simply because the fickle world had suddenly and inconveniently decided to be kind about it. He did not come back at them with insults this time. Insults had only ever been the small opening move, the thing you did to soften a man up. He came back this time with the quiet, patient machinery a man uses when he means to actually and finally win. Blue Ridge Timber ran like every operation of its kind up in those mountains on a whole underground network of arrangements. As old as the ridges themselves, favors traded, and handshakes honored, and backs quietly scratched. And Dale had spent 30 years threading himself all through that network, buying and selling, and doing his own quiet business with half the men who signed the mill's checks. It took him just one afternoon sitting across a desk in the right man's office to plant the careful idea that giving away free reject timber to a family already in default on their mortgage was a liability the company simply did not need to be carrying. That a family about to lose everything might someday turn around and claim the free wood had been part of some obligation or promise might make trouble, might bring a lawyer. The tidy thing he suggested, the sensible thing, the thing a careful and well-run mill did to protect its own interests, was to quietly end the arrangement now before it ever had the chance to become a real problem down the road. He did not once have to lie to do it. He only had to take the truth and frame it in a shape that served him, which is a skill certain men perfect across a lifetime, the exact way other and better men perfect an honest trade. Then he made a second visit, and this one was not to the Whitfields at all, but to the bank in town, where a note in default is not one family's slow tragedy, but only a line item on a page, and where a neighbor arriving with cash in hand and a plausible standing interest in a foreclosed parcel is not an ambush at all, but a convenience, a problem solved before it fully becomes one. Dale let it be known pleasantly unhurriedly over a cup of the bank's bad coffee that he stood ready to purchase the Whitfield acreage the very moment it came available, that he would pay cash and pay it quick, that he would spare the bank the whole long, messy trouble of listing and showing and waiting on a proper sale. And that, of course, naturally, the sooner the entire unpleasant matter got itself resolved, the sooner everyone involved could move along to better things. He did not breathe a word of any of it to the boy or the boy's father. That was the entire point of the exercise. A man like Dale did his real work in rooms the boy would never once be allowed to set foot in, turning the screws down by slow quarter turns in places Caleb could not see and did not know existed, so that when the pressure finally reached the boy, when he finally felt it closing on him, he would not even know where the hand was that he ought to be pushing back against. The screws turned out of sight, and 10 days after the video first crossed the country on a Tuesday morning like every other Tuesday of his life, Caleb was out in the barn when he realized the flatbed had not come. It had never once failed to come. For a solid year, the diesel growl of it climbing the grade had marked his Tuesdays as reliably as the sunrise, the heavy thuds of the unloading a rhythm as constant and dependable as the ridge itself against the sky. He stood in the barn doorway that morning, listening hard to a silence where the truck was supposed to be telling himself Roy was only running late, telling himself the schedule had shifted. An appointment moved until the morning wore on into afternoon, and still there was no truck, no dust rising off the gravel, no fresh mountain of raw possibility landing behind the fence. The great creature stood half-finished at his back, and the log he needed to begin the next of the pieces, the ones he'd half-promised to the strangers who wanted them, the ones that might have turned all those thousands of kind, faraway comments into the actual money that saved his father's house, was not going to arrive. He understood, standing there in the cold, empty quiet, that the silence itself was the message that somebody had reached out and turned off the one tap the boy had left. Roy Tillman came the next day, but he did not come in the flatbed. He came in his own beat-up sedan alone, his cap already in his thick hands, before he had even gotten himself out of the car, moving slow and shamed up the gravel like a man walking the last stretch to a graveside. He would not meet the boy's eyes at first. He turned his cap around and around in his hands, and he worked his jaw, and he looked out a long while at the pile of reject timber he had been faithfully dropping there every single Tuesday for a year, as though he could not quite make himself believe what he had been sent up the mountain to say. When he finally got it out, his slow, easy southern voice had lost every last ounce of its ease, gone rough and low, with a thing that sat down in it like a swallowed stone. "They told me to stop, son," he said. "Come down off an order from up top. No reason give, no reason. I'd believe anyhow. Told me the arrangement's done effective right now. Don't you drop another stick of it out here." He turned the cap another full slow circle in his hands. 30 years I hauled whatever they told me to haul, and never once asked a single question, he said, and this is the first load in all that time I ever hated to leave off the truck. There's men behind this son don't have the plain decency to come do their own dirty work, so they sent an old man up here to do it for him. Caleb stood very still and said nothing. He understood without ever needing the name spoken aloud exactly whose hand was behind it, could all but see the man smiling over the bank's bad coffee. He looked past Roy to the pile that had been one of the last things keeping the land that Firewood, that had been one less expense in a life stripped, cleaned down to nothing but expenses. And he watched a stranger's decision made in a room he would never in his life be allowed to enter. Close over his whole future, the way slow water closes over a dropped stone, without a ripple, without a sound, without any way to reach back in after it. Roy did one thing before he left that the boy would carry with him for a long time to come. From the back seat of his old sedan, he hauled out a single length of maple curly grain figured with a deep rippling flame that would catch and hold the light like water moving over stones. A piece he had plainly picked out from the mill yard with his own two hands before they had sent him up the mountain. He set it down himself at the very edge of the property, grunting with the weight of it, breathing hard when he'd got it settled. Then he set his cap back on his silver head and looked the boy square in the eye at last. "That one there's off my own truck," he said, "not the company's. Ain't a man alive up top can tell an old fella like me what he can and can't do with wood that's already fell down and been hauled. You go and make something out of that, son, something they'll all wish to God they hadn't done this." Then he climbed back into his sedan and backed slow down the gravel. And he lifted two thick fingers off the wheel in a goodbye that looked a great deal more like an apology, and he drove away down the county road for what the two of them both understood might well be the very last time. The days that came after emptied out into a kind of silence Caleb had never known before, and this one had no comfort anywhere in it. None of the good waiting quiet of the barn. Walter came, of course, the moment the news reached him, and he stood in the middle of the barn with his arms folded tight across his chest and his patient blue eyes gone hard with an anger the boy had never once seen in him before. But when Caleb asked him, plainly looking up at him, whether there was anything at all to be done about it, Walter did a rare and a costly thing for a man of his years and his pride. He told the boy the truth. "I know timber, son," he said. "I know old houses and hand-cut joinery and how to bring a dead fallen thing back up to standing. What I do not know is how to fight a man like Crutcher in the rooms where he does his fighting. I've got no money to lay down against his money, no seat at that bank, no say at that mill, no lever anywhere I can pull." He looked at the boy a long time, and there was a real grief in his face, the specific and terrible grief of a man who has finally run headlong into the hard limit of what he can do for someone he has come to love. "I can stand next to you," he said. "I'd count it an honor to stand next to you. But I cannot stand instead of you. Nobody on this earth can. This one is yours to carry, son, whether it's fair or whether it isn't, and God knows it isn't." That night, Caleb walked out to the barn alone. His father was asleep down the hall or was lying awake pretending to be, which came to the same thing between them and the house behind him, held its usual weight, the envelope on top of the refrigerator counting down its 90 days that were now closer to 50. He reached up and switched on the single bulb, and he stood there in the middle of the floor among all the legends he had pulled up out of ruined wood, the walnut monster and the swinging figure and the steel-bright helmet and the great flame-scaled creature waiting at his back with its tail still only pencil lines, and for the first time he let himself feel the entire shape of exactly where he stood. The whole world had discovered him. Thousands of strangers he would never meet wanted the things he made. He had proof at last, undeniable proof, more proof than he could ever have dreamed of, that the thing he saw in discarded wood was real and was worth something to more people than he could count. And every bit of it was going to come to nothing, because a man he could not reach had reached out and cut the wood off at its source, had leaned his weight on a bank that did not know the boy's name, had arranged the whole quiet ruin of a family and offices where a 15-year-old boy had no standing even to knock on the door and ask to be heard. He picked up the curly maple Roy had left him off his own truck, the last log he might ever be given by anyone, and he held it against his chest there in the cold barn, the way you hold a thing you are afraid to set down and lose. He understood now all at once and completely what his father's long silence had been trying to tell him. Across 3 years, what Walter had said to him so plainly that very afternoon, what the empty gravel where the flatbed should have been, had spelled out in a language even a boy could read without being taught. Nobody was coming to save him. Not Walter for all his love. Not Hannah for all her honest camera. Not the thousands of kind, faraway strangers with their kitchen table tears. Not the world's sudden and much too late applause. Whatever he built out of this last piece of maple, whatever he managed to make of the days ticking down over his father's kitchen, he was going to have to make it alone out of the exact material the world had thrown away, which was, he was beginning at last to understand the only material a boy like him had ever really had to work with in the first place. He set the log down on his bench beneath the single bulb. He laid his scarred hand flat against its rippled grain, and he closed his eyes the way he always did, and he waited to hear what it wanted to become. Outside, past the closed barn doors, the pile of reject timber sat silent in the dark, for what looked to be the last time no truck coming ever again to feed it, 50-some days standing between the boy and the loss of everything his family had, the whole crushing weight of it resting now on two hardened young hands, and whatever those hands could still manage to pull loose from a world that had already long ago made up its mind about exactly what he was worth. For 3 days, the curly maple sat untouched on the bench, and the boy sat there with it in the cold, because a thing that decides you are going to have to save yourself does not in the same breath bother to tell you how. He turned the whole problem over and over the way he turned a raw log in his hands, hunting for the shape hidden underneath it, and every single angle he found led him straight back to the same blank dead wall. He could not out-money Dale Crutcher, who had money to spare and a lifetime of knowing how to spend it. He could not out-argue a bank, which did not argue, only calculated. He could not make Blue Ridge Timber start up a truck that a man in an office had already ordered stopped. Every road he could see with his eyes ran directly through rooms he would never in his life be permitted to enter. So at last he stopped looking at the roads altogether. He looked instead at what was actually there in his own two hands, which was the only thing that had ever really been in his hands, a single length of wood. The whole world had already thrown away, sitting under a bare bulb in a barn. He now had barely 50 days left to lose. The answer, when it finally came to him, did not arrive as a new idea at all, so much as the sudden clear memory of a thing he had already known all along without ever looking straight at it. He had been carving other men's legends, the monster and the swinging figure and the helmet, and even the great scaled beast rising up at his back. Every one of them was a borrowed shape, a face the whole world already knew. From 100 screens, and a boy who carves what the world already owns is a boy who can be told by any man rich enough to keep a lawyer that the shapes were never his to sell in the first place. Dale had not yet needed to say the word out loud, but Caleb had felt the sharp edge of it hiding in the man's grin that day in the aisle, in that one-word hustle with a whole formal accusation crouched down inside it, waiting patiently to be made. A borrowed shape was a door that somebody else would always in the end hold the key to. But a dragon that had never once existed anywhere before, a creature dragged up whole and howling out of one particular ruined log and living nowhere else on the face of the earth, that was a thing no man could ever claim, no lawyer could ever challenge, no mill could ever cut off at the source, because the source of it was not the timber at all. The source was the boy. He put his hand flat against the rippled maple, and he closed his eyes and he waited, the way he had always waited since before any of it. And this time the thing he heard rising up to meet him was not any face he had ever seen in any theater. It was something older than that, and stranger, coiled and patient, half serpent and half gathering storm. A creature that had grown the exact way the grain itself had grown, twisting always away from the light and in towards some private idea of what it was meant to be. He began to cut before he had even fully decided to begin the chisel, finding the very first line, the way a forked stick finds hidden water dipping down of its own accord. And for the first time in his whole life, the thing taking shape under his moving hands answered to no one on earth but him. Every ripple in the figured maple became a scale that flowed exactly where the grain flowed, so that the wood and the beast were telling the same story. Every knot he would once have fought and cursed in a borrowed design he now welcomed like a gift, letting it become an eye, a spur, a horn, a place where the creature's own long, hard history showed plainly through its hide. He was not forcing the wood into a shape borrowed off a screen. He was letting the discarded thing finally become the one and only version of itself it could ever possibly have been. Which was, he understood with a slow dawning, as his hands worked on through the night, the exact same thing that had been done to him, the exact same mercy he had spent 3 years learning how to give. He worked on past the point where his hands ached and cramped past the point where the single bulb seemed to dim and swim. And somewhere in those long, dark hours, he found the one sentence that would follow him quietly for the whole rest of his life. And he spoke it low and rough to the empty barn as the first true dragon came loose at last from the grain. Everybody spent a whole year telling me this wood was worth nothing, he said to no one. And they were right. It was worth nothing at all to anybody who couldn't see it. That was never once the wood's problem. The chisel moved on. A single curl of pale maple fell to the floor and joined the drift of the others. And the creature turned its half-made face slowly up toward the light, as though it had been lying there patiently inside that cast-off log since a time long before the boy who was freeing it had ever been born. He did not make just the one. He made a whole company of them. Over the feverish days that followed, sleeping only in stolen snatches. With his head down on the bench, he pulled dragon after dragon up out of the reject pile that still sat waiting behind the fence, because a truck could be ordered to stop delivering, but it could not be ordered to undeliver a whole year of Tuesdays, and that ragged black mountain of ruined timber held more shapes inside it than a boy could carve loose in a lifetime of trying. Each dragon came out of the wood different from the last because no two of those cast-off logs had ever once been alike. The twisted maple gave him a beast that hunched low and folded like a gargoyle on the corner of an old church, its wings drawn in tight around a body that seemed always about to spring. The cracked oak, the piece the mill had rejected precisely for the great fault line running through its heart, gave him a dragon who split and healed over center became a terrible wound. The creature had plainly taken long ago and just as plainly survived, so that people who stood before it later found their hands drifting to their own chests without knowing why. The spalted walnut, all shot through with the black lightning web of the fungus that had cost it its commercial worth, lent that same black veining to a creature that looked struck by lightning in the moment of its making and left standing anyway, unbowed, defiant, more alive for the strike. He was no longer carving in spite of the flaws in the wood. He was carving because of them, chasing them, honoring them, and the pieces that came loose from his hands as a result could not have existed in any other material anywhere on the earth. Dale Crutcher had cut off the supply of new timber, believing in his cold arithmetic that he was starving the boy out. He had only handed him the very last argument the boy needed, which was that Caleb Whitfield did not require good wood at all. He required wood that nobody else on earth wanted, of which the man on the other side of the fence had, by a bitter and perfect irony, an entire county's worth. While the boy carved through his nights, Hannah Reeves did the second thing she had been put on this earth to do, which was to refuse flatly and completely to let a story she believed in die quietly in the dark. Her 11 minutes had already crossed the whole country once and made a boy briefly famous. Now she made a second film, a shorter and a harder one, and there was nothing soft anywhere in this one. She had spent the days since doing the plain work of it, making her calls, pulling on threads, piecing together the whole shape of a thing that a boy alone in a barn could never have seen from the inside. And she laid it all out plainly and in order for the great audience that had already fallen in love with him. She did not once name Dale Crutcher as a villain. She did something a good deal more damaging than that. She simply told the truth in order and trusted the people watching to be smarter than their worst moments. She told them that the 15-year-old boy whose hands they had all watched moving was right now tonight about to lose the only home he had ever known. She told them that the free timber that had fed every one of those carvings had been quietly cut off within a handful of days of the boy's becoming known to the world. She told them last that the neighbor sitting positioned to buy up the foreclosed land at auction happened to run a sawmill of his own on the very next parcel. Then she let the audience do the plain arithmetic she had always trusted them to be able to do, and she ended it not on an accusation but on a single quiet question. Her own steady voice laid over a still frame of the boy's scarred and resting hands. "You all watched him take what the world threw away," she said, "and turn it into something not one of us could look away from. Well, now somebody's trying to throw him away too. I just thought you ought to know that." The internet, which had so freely and so warmly loved the boy, discovered in itself that week that it was capable of a colder and a harder feeling as well, and it turned that feeling loose. People did not simply leave comments this time. This time they dug. Somewhere out in the great restless crowd that had adopted Caleb Whitfield as its own were people who knew in their ordinary daytime lives exactly how to read a public record. People who knew how to pull a county filing. People who found the notice of the pending sale where it sat waiting in the courthouse database. People who noticed a certain name attached to a stated standing interest in the parcel and matched it with no trouble at all to a small rough sawmill 3 rows over from the boy's own table at a craft fair that some of them, it turned out, had actually attended and remembered. And then one person, a woman living up in the mountains not 30 miles from the Whitfield place, who had bought something off Dale's booth that very autumn and felt ever since that she had somehow been cheated, posted the one thing that turned the whole tide over at once. She had purchased what Dale Crutcher's own hand-lettered signage had proudly called handcrafted mountain cedar. And when a piece of it had cracked open in her hands a few weeks later, she had found staring up at her from the fresh split the unmistakable ghost of a factory stamp that had been sanded down but not quite sanded away. The honest grain of any man's own mill. Nowhere to be found anywhere in it. The whole thing bought in bulk off a wholesaler 2 states over and marked up under a flannel-shirted lie. She had photographs of it, and she was, it turned out very quickly, nowhere close to the only one. It moved the way the boy's own video had first moved 1 to 10 to 10,000 and on past counting, except that this time it carried heat where the first had carried wonder. Dale Crutcher, who had built his entire local standing on being the real craftsman, the honest miller, the true man of the mountain, who had every right in the world to look down his nose at a scavenger boy, was revealed all at once to that very same watching audience as a reseller of cheap factory goods dressed up in a costume of homespun authenticity. The men over at Blue Ridge Timber, who had quietly ended the boy's arrangement to please a neighbor, began to receive messages of their own, thousands upon thousands of them, from people who had first watched a boy's hands with love and were now watching a whole company help a proven con man crush that same boy into the dirt. A mill runs on its good name in a small market, the exact same way a boy runs on his. And a name is a terribly fragile thing to hang a whole business on when 10,000 furious strangers all decide at once to test its weight and find it wanting. Within a single week, the same office that had so carefully ordered the truck stopped had a wholly different problem on its hands. One that had nothing at all to do with liability and everything in the world to do with the crowd that had gathered loud and unforgiving outside its own front door. They called Marcus, not Dale and not the bank, but the mill itself, a manager Roy Tillman had worked under faithfully for 20 years, and the arrangement was reinstated with an apology that fooled precisely no one about where it had truly come from. Because a company does not rediscover its lost conscience. In the very same week, it rediscovers its threatened reputation by pure coincidence. The Tuesday after that, the familiar diesel growl came climbing back up the county road, and Roy Tillman himself swung down out of the flatbed cab with his silver head bare and his slow face working hard at something, unable for a long moment to get a single word out at all. When he finally managed it, it came rough as creek gravel. "Told you they'd wind up wishing they hadn't done it," he said. "Didn't rightly figure it'd take the whole entire country to make 'em wish it, but I'll take it however it comes." He set the first fresh log down himself by hand, grunting, the way he'd set down the private one weeks before. Then he looked over at the growing crowd of dragons just visible through the open barn door, and he shook his silver head slow, and he said, the thing an old man says when the whole crooked world briefly and unexpectedly bends back the right way. 50 years I hauled wood up and down these mountains, son, he said. Never one time in all of it got to watch it fight back. And the dragon sold, that is far too small and too flat a word for what actually happened, but it began there with selling. The woman out in Arizona who had lost her son bought the very first one. The dragon whose split oak heart had become a survived and healed over wound. Because she wrote it, looked to her exactly like something that had made it all the way through the very worst thing there was, and come out the other side, with its true shape still somehow intact. Collectors who had first written asking after the borrowed legends now understood without having to be told that the borrowed legends had never once been the real point, that the whole true value of the thing lay in the piece that existed only the single time and could never be ordered twice, and they paid for that accordingly and gladly. Orders came in not by the dozen now, but past all counting, more than the boy could have filled in 10 years of nights. And Caleb, who had spent an entire year unable to give a single one of his pieces away, at a craft fair table found himself standing in the strange new country of having to turn good people down. He did not raise his prices to gouge anyone. He raised them because Walter, when the boy asked him straight, told him plainly that a man who undervalues his own work only teaches the whole rest of the world to undervalue it, right along with him, and because 50 days had by then become 30, and 30 was not very many days at all to raise the kind of money the envelope on the refrigerator was asking for. It was Diane Prescott who finally closed the whole hard distance between merely surviving and being truly saved, and she did it, as it turned out, with time to spare. She arrived on a cold, clear afternoon in a car plainly built for mountain roads, a woman of 36 with long, dark blonde hair, tied back off a lightly tanned face, warm brown eyes that took the full measure of a room before her mouth ever committed to a single word, dressed in the practical, hard-earned elegance of a person who had spent her whole working life walking construction sites rather than posing in showrooms. She was an interior designer out of Charlotte, and she had built her considerable name on luxury mountain lodges, though she had built it the hard and the honest way, having watched one of her earliest and largest projects fail quietly and expensively because she had filled it with mass-produced furniture that photographed beautifully and moved absolutely nothing in a single living human heart. She had spent the whole decade since hunting hard for the exact opposite of that failure for makers whose work could never once be ordered twice. And she had seen Hannah's 11 minutes like the rest of the country had, though she alone, it seemed, had seen in it a thing that the roaring crowd around her had entirely missed. She spent a full hour in the barn without once interrupting the boy's moving hands, drifting among the dragons the way the truly serious ones always move slow and quiet, reading everything, saying nothing at all that she had not first earned the right to say. When she finally did speak, she did not compliment him, which he had by now come to understand was precisely how the ones who actually mattered showed their respect. "You don't carve wood, son," she said. "Anybody at all can carve wood." She rested her warm eyes a long moment on the lightning-struck walnut dragon, the one the black spalting veins had drawn. "You uncover the thing that was already in there waiting the whole time. That is not a skill. Skill I can hire by the dozen. That is an eye, and an eye cannot be bought at any price. It can only be found." Then she told him the thing she had driven 4 hours up the mountain to tell him. She was building the single centerpiece lodge of her whole career, a great timber-framed lodge going up right then on a high ridge 2 counties over, and she wanted his dragon standing in it, a full commission collection. One great beast for the main room and one for each of the principal spaces besides, at a figure she wrote down on the back of her business card, rather than say out loud in a barn where a boy's father might be standing within earshot. Marcus was standing within earshot. He took the card from his son's hand and read the figure written on the back of it, and the boy watched a thing happen in his father's weathered face that he had not once witnessed in 3 long years. A slow, buckling collapse of the whole armor Marcus wore against hope. The sudden wet shine of a hard man doing an arithmetic he had long ago forbidden himself to do. The number on the back of that card was not merely enough to fill an order. It was enough and more than enough to answer the entire envelope, waiting on top of the refrigerator, the overdue mortgage, and the long, grinding tail of the hospital debt, both together enough to lift the whole crushing weight the cancer had left behind, clean up off the 11 acres and the leaning barn and the boy who had carried all of it silently, without one time being asked whether he could bear it. Marcus turned away toward the barn wall for a moment, and his ruined shoulders worked. And when he turned himself back, his eyes were red-rimmed, but his voice, when it came, held steady. "Your mother," he said, and had to stop and start again. "Your mother always did say you saw the things the rest of us just walked on past." He had to stop once more. "She would have given anything on this earth to see what you just went and did with it." But Diane Prescott had said one thing more before she pulled her gloves back on to leave, and it turned out to be the thing that mattered most of all because it drew a hard, clean line the boy might never have thought to draw for himself. She would commission the whole collection, she told him, on one single condition. And the condition was this, that he make every last piece of it exactly the way he had made everything else that had ever come out of that barn. No factory, no shortcuts, no premium clean lumber ordered in from a supplier to make a deadline. She wanted the dragons that came only and ever out of the wood that nobody else on earth had wanted, or else she wanted none of them at all. The whole entire reason this is worth what I'm paying you for it, she said, pulling the second glove on at the barn door, is that a person can't fake how it's made. The very second you buy clean lumber to go a little faster, you are selling exactly what every other shop in the country already sells. Stay poor in your materials, son. It is by a long way the richest thing about you. It was the very same lesson that Roy had left behind in a single length of maple off his own truck. The same lesson the broken walnut tongue had taught the boy on that first cold night a year before arriving now from a third and unexpected direction to make itself at last permanent. She did not make the boy wait on his own salvation either, understanding better than most exactly what a ticking clock could do to a family. She wired a deposit against the commission before her car had even wound its way back down off the mountain. A first payment large enough on its own to stop the immediate bleeding. And it reached the bank in town with more than a week still standing between the Whitfields and the date printed in that bland column on the notice. Marcus drove into town the following morning and paid the overdue mortgage current in front of a teller who had known his late wife, and the foreclosure that Dale Crutcher had been so patiently arranging in rooms the boy would never enter simply came apart in the man's hands quietly, the way a thing does when the one lever it depended on is suddenly gone. The rest of the debt, the long hospital tail of it, would take the full commission and the steady sales that came behind it to answer in full. And that answering would run on through the winter and into the spring, one payment at a time. But the land itself was safe from the moment that wire cleared. The ground beneath their feet was theirs. And the boy took the commission, and he took the condition that came with it gladly, because the condition was not a burden laid on him at all, but only a stranger's recognition of the single law he had ever carved by. He would not save his home with borrowed methods any more than he had been willing to save it with borrowed shapes. Whatever he built to pull his father out from under the long shadow of the disease that had already taken so much from them both, he would build it the same way he had built every other thing out of the exact material the whole world had thrown away at his own scarred bench by his own two hands alone. Dale Crutcher came one last time. He came at dusk in the mud-brown crew cab, but the man who climbed down out of it that evening had lost all the easy ownership from his walk. The exposed lie had done to Dale exactly what a hard season of storms does to old paint, curling it, stripping it, leaving the gray-weathered truth of the thing showing underneath. His booth at the coming fair had been quietly refused. His name in the small, tight market that had been the whole of his standing for 30 years had turned overnight from an asset a man could trade on into a wound that would not close. The bank that had listened so warmly to his talk of a quick, clean cash sale had gone cool the very moment his own name became the kind that drew a crowd with torches in its hands. He had watched powerless as the boy he had publicly branded a scavenger became the one thing that would save the very ground he had waited years to take. And he had come now in the end, to do the only thing a certain low kind of man knows to do when the pressure he was used to applying comes running suddenly back the other way. He had come to threaten what little was left. Marcus started for the porch steps, but the boy was already moving, already crossing the yard, and something in the way Caleb moved out to meet the man stopped his father cold where he stood and held him there. This was not the withdrawn and frightened child who had hidden his face from every eye in that fairground aisle. Something had hardened and settled in the boy across those long weeks of carrying a weight no boy his age should ever have had to lift, and he walked out to meet Dale Crutcher in the last failing light of the day, with his scarred hands loose and easy at his sides, and his hazel eyes level and steady on the man, in a way they had never once managed to be steady on any human face before. Walter had told him the plain truth of it weeks earlier, that this fight was his alone to carry, that nobody living could stand in his place. He had heard it then as a sentence of pure loneliness, a door closing. He understood it now as something a great deal closer to a gift. Dale opened with the thing that had always worked for him, the pleasant practice cruelty pitched precisely to unsettle. "Enjoy it while it lasts, boy," he said. "The internet's got a short little memory on it. 6 months from now, nobody will so much as recall your name, and I will still be right there next door when that note comes due all over again someday." He let it hang in the cold air between them, waiting for the flinch the way he'd waited and watched for it that day at the fair. The flinch did not come. The boy looked at him for a long, quiet, unhurried moment. Then he said the thing that ended it, and he did not say it loud, and he did not say it cruel. He said it only true, which is the single kind of thing that has ever actually ended anything. You spent a whole year looking at that pile of wood behind my house, he said, and every single time, all you were ever able to see in it was what was wrong with it. That's the whole difference between you and me, Mr. Crutcher. Right there. You have built your entire life out of only ever being able to see what's wrong with things. And I feel sorry for you. I mean it. It must be an awful, awful way to have to look at the world. Dale had come armored that evening against a boy's anger, against a boy's fear, against a boy who might beg or bluster or break down in front of him. He had no armor anywhere on him for pity, because pity is a thing a man can only ever receive from someone standing above him. And he understood in that one terrible moment, with the boy's steady eyes resting on him, and the whole company of dragons just visible through the open barn door, catching and holding the very last of the day's light, that the ground between them had shifted entirely and for good, that the 15-year-old boy in the sawdust cap was not standing beneath him at all, and quite possibly never once had been. He opened his mouth. Nothing that was in it was worth the saying. He closed it again. He turned and he climbed back up into the crew cab, and he backed down the gravel a good deal slower than he had ever driven it before, and he drove himself out to the county road for the last time, carrying his contempt back home with him to the small, rough mill where it had always belonged. The boy stood and watched the tail lights shrink and go, and then he turned back toward the barn, where his father stood waiting in the doorway, and neither of the two of them said a single word, because some victories are far too quiet to need any announcing. The commission carried them clean through the winter, and it did a great deal more than that. Diane Prescott's lodge opened up on its high ridge in the first true warmth of the spring, with the dragons standing in it, and the people who came from all over to see the famous new lodge came away, every one of them talking about the dragons instead, so that soon other lodges wanted their own, and then private collectors wanted them. And then a small, serious museum of folk art down in the Piedmont wrote asking whether it might mount a whole show of nothing at all but the boys' work. The money came in behind all of it and answered the envelope on top of the refrigerator in full. First the last of the mortgage, and then over the slow-turning months, the long grinding tail of the hospital debt, one payment and then the next, until one ordinary evening in early summer. Marcus took the final statement down off the top of the refrigerator, and he read it once through standing under the kitchen light, and he set it down on the table without a single word, and he walked out to the barn to go and stand beside his son in a shared silence that had finally, after 3 long years of it, lost its terrible weight and become only peace. The 11 acres were theirs. The leaning barn was theirs. The pile behind the fence was theirs, and it would never once again be the reason they might lose everything, because a boy had gone and made it instead the very reason they had managed to keep it all. They fixed the barn in time, though they went about it careful. They reinforced the sagging old floor with new oak beams laid in true. They replaced the windows that had leaked cold through every Appalachian winter anyone could remember. They ran proper wiring at last, so that the work no longer hung on a single bare bulb, and an orange extension cord snaked across the frozen yard from the house. But Caleb would not let his father replace the old workbench, the scarred and stained and stubborn one, where the very first ruined dragon had split its neck clean away, where the walnut tongue had broken off in the dark and taught the boy the single truest thing he had ever learned. That's where I found out the wood was never the problem, he said when Marcus reached to haul it out. I'm not about to go throwing away the one place that taught me not to throw things away. So the old bench stayed exactly where it was, holding its ground at the very heart of the growing workshop that rose up careful around it. And Marcus, without a word about it, carved a simple sign one evening out of a leftover maple board, and he hung it himself above the wide barn door, and then he only stood there beside his son in the dooryard, looking up at it until the sun had gone all the way down behind the ridge, which was the way the Whitfield men had always from the beginning said the things to each other that they could not otherwise say. Blue Ridge timber changed too in the slow way that people change when a thing they had always scorned turns out unexpectedly to matter after all. The same men who had once thoughtlessly mixed the boys' rejects in with the plain burn pile scrap now set the strangest and the wildest pieces carefully aside. The most riotously figured maple, the walnut with the most impossibly twisted heart. And they took to calling the barn before they even loaded the truck, because they had all learned the hard and public way exactly what a boy could see, waiting inside the wood that they themselves had walked past blind for years. Roy Tillman hauled it faithfully up the county road every Tuesday until the season. He finally retired for good, and on his very last run, he did not drop the load at the eastern corner the way he had 1,000 times before. He carried the single best log of the whole load straight up to the barn door by hand, breathing hard, and he set it down there at the boy's bench. And he told him plainly that it was the finest piece of reject timber he had pulled off a pile in 50 years of pulling, and that a man ought to end his working life leaving the very best thing he had left in the hands of the one person most likely to do right by it. Even the neighbors came around in the end, which is the slowest kind of change there is anywhere in this world, because a man who has openly laughed at you has to do the hard work of unlaughing in front of every single soul who watched him do it. They began one family and then another to bring their own children out to the place, the very same families who had hollered about Firewood from the safety of their passing pickups a year and more, before wanting their sons and their daughters to stand in the barn where a boy had turned pure garbage into a name people knew. They wanted the children to understand a thing the boy's whole story taught far more plainly than any Sunday lecture ever could. That talent was never once a bolt of lightning that reached down and chose you or passed you cruelly by, but was instead a thing built patiently up one ordinary discarded afternoon at a time out of failure, mostly out of ruin, mostly out of the very pieces of yourself that the whole world stood ready to throw away. Gus Merrick came last of all, which was somehow the most fitting thing because he had been among the very loudest of them a year before. He was 70, a long-retired carpenter whose big, rough hands still carried in them the permanent shape of a lifetime spent raising barns and framing houses all across the western counties, standing tall just under 6 feet, with deep-lined, weathered skin and thick white brows and a neatly kept gray mustache. He had lost his own small construction business in a downturn a decade back, watched it go under through no true fault of his own, and the slow losing of it had left him privately and permanently certain that dreams were a thing the world only ever charged a man for. In the end, that a fellow who stood around talking about impossible things was only a fellow setting himself up patient as a lamb to be robbed. He had been one of the ones who called the boys' pile firewood from the safe rolled-up window of a passing truck. He walked into the barn slow that late afternoon, leaning now on a cane he had not needed a year before, and he stopped himself short in front of the great flame-scaled creature, finished at long last, all its thousands of scales cut clean at the end, its vast muscles moving beneath the flowing grain, as though the whole enormous beast had only paused there mid-stride and might yet at any moment finish the step it had started. He stood before it a long, long time, and then he reached up and took off his cap the way a man takes off his cap, standing at a graveside or in the back of a church, and he held it against his chest with both his old hands. "I owe you an apology, son," he said. Caleb looked up from his work honestly and completely at a loss for what he asked him. The old man's wet eyes stayed fixed on the dragon, ashamed to come away from it. "I spent 40 years of my life looking at wood," he said, "cutting it, joining it, building whole houses out of it, learning it. And I passed that pile behind your place 100 times if I passed it once, and every single time I called it trash, same as all the rest of them did." His rough voice caught in his throat, and he made it steady again by main force. "And not one time," he said, "not one single time in all of it did I ever once see what you saw in it. A man builds his whole entire life up around thinking he surely knows a thing through and through, and then a boy comes along out of nowhere and shows him gentle as you please that he'd been half blind to it the whole while." Caleb set down his chisel on the old bench, and when he answered the old man, it was gentle, without a single trace anywhere in it of the thing a lesser person might have felt entitled by that moment to feel. "They're the same logs, Mr. Merrick," he said quietly. "Nothing ever changed about the wood." The old man shook his white head slowly and settled his cap back down onto it. "I know it, son," he said. "I surely do know it. But you taught a whole hollow full of grown men and women how to stand in front of it and look at it different, and there are not many men who leave a thing like that behind them in this world, let alone at 15. That conversation stayed with the boy a long while after Gus Merrick had made his slow, careful way back down the gravel and gone. Late that very same golden afternoon, the Blue Ridge flatbed came grinding up the county road the way it had come up it, 1,000 Tuesdays before, and Roy Tillman, not yet retired that season, swung himself down out of the cab and into the long gold light with a wide grin already on his face. He hollered across the yard that he had found something the boy was going to want to see, an unusual maple, the grain gone wild and twisting in it in exactly the way Roy had learned over the years to recognize as the boy's particular kind of trouble. Caleb walked out across the yard to meet the truck. He laid his scarred hand flat against the rough bark of the log before it had even come the rest of the way off the trailer, and he closed his eyes for a moment, the way he always had, the way he had since long before any of it. Since he was a small, quiet boy with his grandfather's worn, bone-handled pocket knife in his fist, and a whole head full of branches waiting to become birds. Somewhere down beneath the weathered gray skin of the thing, another shape was already there, already waiting. Another creature the whole careless world had thrown away without ever once knowing what it held. The country in the end decided among itself that Caleb Whitfield had become known because a boy could carve extraordinary things up out of ruined wood. The boy himself understood that the truth of it was quieter than that, and plainer, and a great deal harder to fit into 11 minutes of anything. The gift had never once been in his hands, though his hands had learned across those years a very great deal. The gift was that he had refused all the way through his grief and through the mockery and through the slow, patient machinery of a man who had wanted only to erase him, to look at any single discarded thing, a log, a barn, a life left half broken by loss, and see nothing in it but what was wrong. The wood behind the house had always been precisely and exactly what it was. The logs themselves never changed, not one of them, not ever. What changed was that a boy had shown a whole hollow full of people how to stand in front of the thrown-away thing and see, instead of an ending, the plain shape of what it might still yet become. And once a person has truly learned to look at the whole world in that one way, there is no unlearning it ever again, no truck that any man can order stopped, no bank anywhere that can foreclose upon it, no neighbor left living who can ever reach out and take it back.